Hey guys. Tonight we're taking a step back in time to a world where sleep wasn't the blissful retreat we know today, but more like a strange, uncomfortable ritual full of quirks and unspoken rules. Picture yourself walking through a dimly lit medieval village, the air heavy with the smell of wood smoke, farm animals, and the unmistakable mustiness of a long day's work. You're tired, ready to rest. But you quickly realize that sleep back then wasn't like the cushy, soft-pillowed luxury we're used to. Nope. This is a world of hard surfaces, communal spaces, and, well, a whole lot of shared discomfort. You probably wouldn't survive the night without a little grit, and let's face it, your modern mattress and air conditioning would be sorely missed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. Makes this whole bedtime thing feel like we're all sharing in the story together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably heard of medieval times as a period of hardship and discomfort. But one of the things that'll surprise you is how they slept. Or rather, how they didn't sleep. Forget about those full 8-hour snoozes you're accustomed to. The concept of sleeping through the night wasn't even on their radar. Instead, most people had segmented sleep, which meant breaking the night into 2 or more chunks. You'd go to bed after dusk, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night for a while before going back to sleep until dawn. Sounds a bit odd? Right, historians still argue whether this sleep pattern was common across all medieval classes or mostly seen in rural areas, but the evidence is there. It was like the medieval equivalent of half-sleeping through the night. The whole idea of segmented sleep wasn't seen as strange back then. In fact, people often used the waking time between sleep cycles for things like praying, visiting neighbors, or even having quiet, intimate moments with their partners. This nighttime wakefulness, sometimes referred to as the first sleep and second sleep, was a natural part of their rhythm, driven by the absence of electric lights and the rhythms of nature. They'd even keep candles burning or stoke the fire, turning the dark hours into a space for activity, reflection, and rest. Imagine trying to adjust your modern sleep cycle to this odd rhythm. Waking up in the middle of the night with no Netflix to scroll through. And the best part, you were far from alone in this. The whole household, or even your neighbors, might be awake at different times of night too. Not quite the isolated, me time we crave today. But it was their norm. Now, let's dive into the peculiar idea of segmented sleep and how it shaped medieval people's lives. If you think about it, breaking your sleep into 2 chunks doesn't sound all that bad. It's like getting 2 naps with a break in between. Right, in theory, it should be amazing, especially when you consider that the time in between was used for, well, pretty much whatever you wanted. Imagine the luxury of getting up, stretching your legs, and doing something productive or even intimate while everyone else was still lost in their first round of sleep. Sounds like a scene out of a medieval romance, doesn't it? But the truth is, this segmented sleep was born out of necessity rather than indulgence. With no electricity to keep the night alive with artificial light, people had to rely on candles and the natural cycle of the sun. After it got dark, the only light they had was the dim glow of a candle or a hearth fire, which wasn't ideal for long periods of wakefulness. So, people would retire to their beds after dusk for their first sleep, which could last anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. And then, Once that sleep cycle ended, they'd rise again, sometimes for up to an hour or more, to read, pray, chat with loved ones, or even sneak in some quiet work. Historians still argue whether this sleep pattern was a necessity due to the lack of light, or if it was more of a spiritual and cultural practice. Some believe the second sleep was used to reflect or engage in religious observances like midnight prayers. Others claim it was simply a way to fit more productivity or socialization into the hours that would otherwise have been wasted. Whatever the case, there's no denying that medieval people had a far more flexible, fragmented sleep schedule than we do today. Imagine trying to keep your eyes open at 2 a.m. with just the dim glow of a candle, while your neighbor might be up as well, tinkering with his tools or visiting friends for a quick chat. It wasn't just about rest. It was about how to occupy that odd space between your two sleep sessions. No scrolling through Instagram, no Netflix marathons, just the comforting sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional murmur of voices in the night. One quirky tidbit. This sleep pattern may have even influenced how people viewed the concept of sleep and time itself. Since the nights were broken up, many medieval people didn't quite see time the way we do now. Hours didn't have the same rigid definition, and the idea of sleeping straight through the night wasn't even a goal. Their time was more fluid, dictated by natural cycles, and segmented sleep was just part of the rhythm of life. Let's now turn to the unsung hero of medieval sleep, candles. You probably take lighting for granted. Just flick a switch, and boom, you've got brightness. But back in the medieval period, lighting was a big deal, especially at night when you were trying to get some rest, or not, as it turns out. The humble candle was the lifeline of nighttime activity and, more importantly, a critical part of the sleep routine. You can imagine it now. The flicker of candlelight, the dim glow illuminating the dark corners of a thatched cottage or the grand chamber of a stone castle. But candles were far from the cozy, scented luxury we've come to associate with modern-day evenings. They were small, often made of tallow, animal fat, and burned dimly, not offering much warmth or visibility. In fact, the flickering light made everything around you seem slightly unreal. Shadows dancing on the walls, the edges of furniture barely visible, and everything feeling just a little more mysterious. Candles didn't just illuminate. They added an eerie ambiance that would shape your sleep experience. Now, why were candles so important to sleep back then? Simple. There was no electric light to keep people up late. People relied on their candles to get the most out of the few hours of daylight they had. But once the candles burned out, it was time to hit the hay, or wake up for your second sleep session. You didn't want to waste that precious light. So you might work, socialize, or engage in quiet, reflective activities during the dark hours before you retired to your bed. But, like most things medieval, candles weren't just a matter of convenience, they were a luxury. Only the wealthier folk could afford them regularly, while the poorer classes relied on cheaper, less effective lighting sources like rushlights or small oil lamps. Historians still argue whether the lack of light during the night created a sense of privacy in the early hours, or if it fostered more communal living in the darker parts of the evening. In either case, the candle was the gateway to both activity and rest, and without it, you'd be stumbling in the dark, waiting for the natural rhythm of sleep to kick in. A quirky detail. People sometimes slept with their candles burning near their beds, especially in the middle of the night during the waking period between sleep cycles. This was both for safety and, dare I say, to keep the darkness at bay. Imagine trying to go back to sleep with a candle flickering beside you. It wasn't a soft, calming glow like we have today, more like a stubborn reminder that the world outside was still very much alive. The role of candles wasn't just about light, though. They were a tool for both work and rest, a quiet symbol of the medieval world's deep dependence on fire. In some ways, the way medieval people used candles mirrors their entire approach to nighttime life. Practical, resourceful, and full of adaptability. When the candle was extinguished, it was time to close your eyes. No more tasks, just sleep. Or was it? Now, let's talk about where and how medieval people actually slept. You might assume that sleeping arrangements in medieval times were simple, basic, and, well, a little uncomfortable. You're not wrong, unless, of course, you were one of the lucky few who could afford luxurious, feather-stuffed beds fit for royalty. But for most medieval folks, sleep was a far cry from the cozy comfort of modern mattresses. Imagine walking into a medieval peasant's home, a small, dimly lit space where the family sleeps in shifts, on beds made of straw or wool, tucked under thick, rough-hewn blankets. Beds were often simple wooden frames with a mattress stuffed with hay or straw, soft by medieval standards, but nothing like the plush cushions we're used to today. Imagine the smell of the hay, the rustle as you lie down, hoping for a decent night's rest. If you're unlucky, that straw mattress might attract pests like fleas, lice, and bed bugs. And let's not even get started on the animals. Sometimes, people shared their sleeping space with farm animals like chickens or pigs. Yes, you heard that right. The whole family, including livestock, huddled together for warmth and safety. But it wasn't just the peasants who had to endure questionable sleeping conditions. Even the nobles didn't have the luxury of today's perfect mattress. Sure, their beds were larger and fancier, think tall. Wooden frames draped with heavy curtains to keep out drafts. But the bedding itself was still rudimentary compared to our modern standards. Noble beds often had feather mattresses, but they were typically stuffed with down and covered with rich tapestries, which could be quite stiff and uncomfortable, particularly in colder months. Historians still argue about how much comfort these beds really provided. Was it just the social status of having a larger, more elaborate bed that made the nobles feel they were sleeping better? Or was there any real comfort to be found? The truth is probably somewhere in between. If you're cold and tired, any bed will feel like a relief. But those large, heavy feather beds were still far from the soft, adjustable beds we're used to today. A quirky tidbit. The heavy bed curtains weren't just for warmth or decoration. They served as a form of privacy, while privacy is an everyday expectation in modern life. It wasn't as common in medieval times. Families lived in close quarters, and sleeping areas were often shared. So these curtains provided the illusion of seclusion. However, they didn't guarantee peace and quiet. Imagine trying to sleep while the rest of the household was awake, working, talking, or even working their animals into the same space. And here's the thing about the lack of comfort. Medieval people were more used to it than we could ever imagine. Comfort, as we know it today, didn't really factor into their lives. Their focus was survival, and rest was just that. A break from work, a necessary pause to gather energy for the day ahead. Let's take a step back now and think about the space where medieval people actually slept. It wasn't the quiet, serene retreat you might imagine. It was often a place shared with not just family, but, in some cases, animals and the persistent chill of the medieval world. The bedroom itself was quite different from what we picture today. And it was more than just a place to sleep. It was a multifunctional space where work, rest, and socializing often overlapped. In a typical peasant home, the bedroom wasn't a separate, private space. It was likely part of the main room, which also doubled as the kitchen and living area. The floor was dirt, or at best, packed earth, with a small hearth burning somewhere in the center of the room to provide warmth and light. The bed, a wooden frame often covered with blankets or straw, would be tucked in the corner of the room. You'd be lucky if you had a bit of privacy. After all, your whole family and maybe even a few animals would be crammed in together, especially during the cold winter months, with everyone in close quarters, including farm animals like chickens and pigs. Privacy wasn't really a luxury you could afford. A mainstream fact is that the hearth was central to life in medieval homes, especially during sleep. It wasn't just for cooking. It served as the primary heat source, often directly affecting where people slept. You'd huddle near the fire for warmth, but the smoke would also fill the air, creating an atmosphere far from the fresh air we enjoy today. The smoke also created a perpetual haze in the room, which could make sleeping even more uncomfortable. But it was a small price to pay for the warmth it provided. As for sleeping arrangements in wealthier households, they were only slightly better. Nobles had larger beds, usually with more padding, though these were often stiff and uncomfortable by modern standards. Their rooms were bigger, yes, but they were still drafty and cold. The rooms often lacked adequate insulation. The bed itself would have been draped with heavy curtains to block out the cold. But those curtains didn't exactly make for a restful night's sleep. In fact, they sometimes trapped dampness in the air, making the environment even more uncomfortable. Historians still debate the extent of comfort in medieval homes. Were they just a bit more used to discomfort? Or were there some hidden luxuries that we're overlooking? While nobility enjoyed larger, more private rooms, it seems the true luxuries were reserved for the very few. Everyone else made do with shared spaces, rough mattresses, and a constant battle against cold and discomfort. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people often kept their beds covered with bed hangings made of thick wool or linen, which were supposed to keep the heat in. It's like they invented medieval-style duvets, but without the fluff. These heavy fabrics were probably a bit stifling at night, but they were necessary for survival, especially in colder climates. They were essentially your medieval version of a heated blanket, minus the heat. You might feel a little better about your cushy, quiet, temperature-controlled bedroom after hearing all this. Still, it's a reminder of how resourceful people were in making the best of what they had. Their sleep may not have been as comfortable as ours, but it was an essential part of their daily rhythms. Now that we've got a feel for the environment where medieval people slept, let's talk about how the hearth, yes, the fire, played a pivotal role in both their lives and their sleep. You might think of the hearth as just a cozy fire to warm you up after a long day. Well, in medieval times, it was so much more than that. It was practically the center of the household, acting as a source of warmth, light, and cooking power. And yes, it was right there in the room where people were trying to sleep. Imagine your bed positioned just a few feet from a fire that's blazing away to keep you from freezing in the bitter night air. The heat is welcoming at first, but soon it becomes oppressive. You shift and toss in your straw mattress, hoping for sleep. But the warmth from the fire never lets up, and the air feels stifling. It's like having the world's largest space heater blasting at you all night. Comforting at first, but eventually, you start longing for just a little fresh air. The fire was absolutely essential for survival during the medieval period, especially in the colder months, when temperatures could plunge and a night without it could be deadly. A single hearth provided heat for the entire home, and in many cases, the bed was placed as close to the hearth as possible to get the most warmth. That meant families slept close to the flames, often within arm's reach of the fire, making for an uncomfortable and restless night's sleep. You'd be warm. Yes, but your comfort was a delicate balancing act. Too close to the fire, and you risked overheating or even catching your bedding on fire. Too far, and you'd freeze. Historians still argue whether the medieval folks were more used to the discomfort of this constant heat and smoke, or if they simply didn't have many options. The fire was their lifeline, but it also made sleep a strange mixture of warmth and suffocating closeness. For peasants, it was the reality of living in a small, poorly insulated home. For wealthier folk, though, the fire was a bit more manageable. They had larger homes with multiple rooms, which made it easier to control the temperature by keeping the hearths to one side of the house and sleeping rooms elsewhere. Still, the air would always be thicker and less breathable than it is in our modern homes. The smoke and soot would linger, seeping into clothing and bedding, and making the air heavy with that distinct fireplace smell. And here's the quirky bit. People didn't just use the fire to warm up at night. They also used it as a kind of social anchor. Imagine the medieval version of Netflix and chill, gathering around the hearth with your family, friends, and maybe a few livestock, sharing stories, food, and warmth until you all settled down to sleep. Some historians suggest that because of the hearth's central role, many people didn't see it as abnormal to sleep in a room filled with both family members and animals. Why? Because that warmth kept everything in harmony, even if that meant sharing your bed space with a goat or a chicken. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight in your climate-controlled, bug-free bedroom, think about the medieval hearth, where warmth and sleep were not separate experiences, but a complex, somewhat suffocating blend of necessity and discomfort. The warmth from the hearth kept them alive, but it certainly didn't guarantee a peaceful night's sleep. Now that we've talked about the basics of medieval sleep environments, let's explore something a little more, shall we say, awkward. The idea of communal sleeping. Forget privacy. In medieval times, the concept of sleeping alone was not only rare, but it was also somewhat of a luxury. The idea of having your own bedroom, your own space, was a distant dream for most people. Instead, medieval people often slept in the same room as their families, friends, and sometimes even strangers. Imagine this. You're getting ready for bed after a long day of working in the fields or at the forge. Your tiny, drafty room is filled with the soft sounds of snoring from your siblings and maybe even a couple of farm animals. No, this isn't some medieval sleepover. It's just how things were. The bed itself was a family affair, whether it was a simple straw mattress in the corner or a large, shared bed with multiple people piled in. The larger the family, the more crowded the bed. And don't forget the animals. A medieval peasant's home was often so small that it was common to have chickens or pigs sharing the room. After all, the warmth of the animals helped keep the space comfortable in the colder months. Historians still debate whether communal sleeping was truly a hardship, or whether it was simply accepted as a fact of life. Some suggest that it was a means of survival. With limited space, resources, and heat, it made sense to huddle together for warmth and security. After all, This was a time when homes were smaller and colder, with drafts sneaking in through every crack. Sleeping close to others, whether they were family or animals, made it easier to survive the harsh winters and kept you safe from potential intruders. But others argue that communal sleeping, particularly with animals, was an uncomfortable norm that most people probably didn't think too much about. It was just the way things were. The upper class, of course, had more privacy. But even they didn't sleep alone. Their large beds could accommodate a few people comfortably, either family or staff. For instance, a nobleman's bed would often be shared with his wife and children, or possibly his servants, depending on the situation. That privacy we're so used to in our modern bedrooms, it was a rare luxury, even for the wealthy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval homes featured sleeping boxes, small, enclosed spaces meant to provide a little more privacy for people who needed it, like the heads of the household. These boxes, often just a bit larger than a large cupboard, were essentially beds enclosed on all sides, providing a tiny bit of separation from the communal sleeping space. It wasn't a private bedroom by any means, but it was a step up from sleeping in the open. You can probably imagine how difficult it must have been to get any real rest with all that noise, movement, and the occasional snort from the livestock. And yet, despite these discomforts, medieval people made do. Sleep wasn't just about rest. It was part of the rhythm of daily life, woven into the complex layers of family, community, and survival. It might not have been the sleep of luxury or solitude, but it was what people knew, and in that way, it was strangely comforting. Now, let's shift our focus to the interesting, yet slightly odd, bedtime rituals and customs that medieval people followed. While many of us wind down our days with a cup of tea or a relaxing bath, medieval folks had their own set of pre-sleep rituals that often mixed religion, superstition, and practicality. Picture this. The day is winding down, the fire's still flickering, and you're getting ready for bed. But before you lay your head down, there were certain rituals you had to follow. These weren't just habits. They were essential parts of the nighttime routine that involved a little bit of superstition and a lot of social norms. First, let's talk about prayer. It was common in the Middle Ages for people to pray before going to sleep. This wasn't just about spiritual peace, but about safety. With life being as unpredictable as it was back then, plagues, wars, and accidents were a constant threat. Prayer before sleep was a way to ensure a peaceful night and protection from evil spirits or ill fortune. People would kneel by their beds, recite prayers, or make the sign of the cross, all in an attempt to guard against nightmares, sickness, or worse. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually believed that prayers could protect them physically, or if they simply felt more psychologically comforted by the act. But the presence of these bedtime prayers in both religious and non-religious households suggests that many people took comfort in them, even if they didn't entirely believe in their power to keep bad things at bay. Now, let's get to the weird part: superstitions. Nighttime in the medieval world wasn't just about laying your head on a pillow and drifting off. It was a time ripe with beliefs about the supernatural. People didn't just fear the dark for its physical dangers, but for the unknown forces that might lurk in the shadows. The belief in evil spirits and demons was strong, and many people took active steps to ward them off before bed. You might hang garlic around your neck or sprinkle holy water in the corners of the room to keep away malicious entities. In some areas, people would place sharp objects, like knives or swords, under their beds. believing it would keep the devil or evil spirits from disturbing their sleep. A quirky tidbit. If you woke up in the middle of the night, you might have a bit of trouble getting back to sleep, especially if you were worried about spirits. In those cases, people sometimes kept a candle near their bed, not just for light, but to ward off any nighttime intruders. Some would even keep a small piece of iron beside them, believing it had the power to chase away evil. Now, let's not forget the social aspect of medieval bedtimes. While today's culture may prioritize silence and solitude as we prepare for bed, medieval people often engaged in lively bedtime activities. For instance, families might tell stories or recount the events of the day before sleep. This communal aspect of winding down was essential, especially in households where people were packed closely together. It wasn't uncommon for parents to tuck their children into bed with a story. But the bedtime stories weren't always the fairy tales we think of today. Instead, they might involve local legends, cautionary tales, or religious teachings that reinforced community values. Historians still debate the psychological effects of these bedtime rituals. Were they a soothing comfort? Or did they serve a more practical purpose in helping people cope with the chaos and uncertainty of medieval life? In any case, it's clear that the act of preparing for sleep wasn't as simple as turning off the lights and slipping under the covers. It was a time for reflection, superstition, and bonding, an important part of medieval life that can feel strangely familiar, even if it's centuries old. Let's now tackle a topic that may make you grateful for your modern bed sheets: hygiene. In medieval times, sleeping in a bed was often an exercise in enduring, rather than luxuriating in, cleanliness. If you've ever complained about not being able to take a shower before bed, get ready to be thankful for modern plumbing. Let's be clear, hygiene, as we understand it today, wasn't exactly a priority in medieval times. People bathed infrequently, and this applied to their sleeping arrangements too. Bedding wasn't washed regularly, so the same straw or wool that made up the mattress would be slept on day after day. Imagine the smells of sweat, dust, and whatever else had settled in the straw, slowly building up over time. And remember, there wasn't much in the way of personal care products either. No lavender-scented sheets or body sprays to mask the odor. People typically slept in their clothes, which didn't exactly help with freshness either. Historians still debate whether medieval people were more tolerant of dirt than we are today, or whether they simply didn't know how to keep things clean. Some argue that since bathing wasn't a regular part of life, people's immune systems might have adjusted to the filth. Others suggest that because personal hygiene wasn't as emphasized, medieval people were just accustomed to the discomfort of their living conditions, and they simply didn't mind it as much as we do now. Either way, their concept of cleanliness was vastly different from ours, and they didn't have access to the same level of comfort and care we have in our modern, sanitized bedrooms. A quirky tidbit: people often used herbs and flowers to try to mask unpleasant odors. Lavender, rosemary, and other strong-smelling plants were placed under pillows or in corners of the room, not just for their scent, but also because they were believed to ward off evil spirits. These fragrant plants became a way to combat not only unpleasant smells, but also to fend off the bad luck that was thought to linger in dirty places. So, while you may get a fresh scent from your laundry detergent, medieval people relied on plants to help their bedding feel and smell less repulsive. As if that weren't enough, let's not forget the little creatures that often inhabited the beds: bed bugs, fleas, lice, and even rats. Depending on where you lived, people slept in constant contact with these pests, which made an already uncomfortable situation even worse. The same straw and wool mattress that kept you warm at night also served as a prime breeding ground for these critters. Medieval homes often had little in the way of pest control, so these tiny invaders were just part of life. People had to deal with itchy bites and the constant irritation of these creatures in their sleeping spaces, adding yet another layer of discomfort to their already long days. Yet, despite all this, medieval people made do. They found ways to cope with these conditions, and their concept of comfort was far different than what we expect today. They didn't have the luxury of taking a nice hot shower before bed, of course, but they did have ways to make their environment as tolerable as possible. Keeping their bedding somewhat fresh with herbs, changing their clothes, eventually, and sleeping in communal spaces all helped make the best of a less than ideal situation. As you lie in your clean, soft bed tonight, remember the layers of discomfort medieval people endured in their quest for rest. While we might grumble about our own inconveniences, they had to face much harsher realities, even in something as simple as sleep. The idea of cleanliness was more of a concept than a reality for most medieval folk. But it was something they adapted to, just as we adapt to our own little nuisances today. Let's now take a closer look at the sharp contrast between the sleep experiences of the wealthy versus the poor in medieval times. Picture this. On one hand, you have a noble's luxurious, albeit still uncomfortable, sleeping quarters. Large beds with curtains to keep out the cold, warm blankets, and possibly even a feather mattress. On the other, the peasant is making do with a small, cramped space, often sleeping on a straw mattress shared with family members, maybe even a goat or a pig. No, this wasn't some medieval sleepover. It was a matter of practicality, survival, and social class. Noble families were fortunate enough to have private rooms with relatively better sleeping conditions. Wealthy households could afford beds made from solid wood or intricately carved frames, often with thick mattresses stuffed with feathers or down. The wealthy could also enjoy heavy bed curtains, designed to block out drafts and ensure warmth, while the mattresses themselves were nothing like the plush ones we enjoy today. At least the wealthy had the luxury of a relatively decent place to rest. Even so, these beds were still firm, and the bedding, though richer than the peasants', was stiff and uncomfortable by modern standards. However, for the wealthy, it wasn't just the bed that made sleep more bearable. It was also the privacy. Sleeping alone was a luxury few could afford, but at least the nobility had the option of a secluded, personal space, away from the constant presence of the rest of the household. Imagine retreating to a space where you could close the heavy curtains, secure in the knowledge that you had a modicum of privacy, something that would have been almost impossible for the average peasant. Historians still debate whether the social divide between the wealthy and poor when it came to sleep was solely about comfort, or if it was also a reflection of a deeper societal divide. It was certainly about status. The ability to sleep alone, in a more private, comfortable space, was a clear indicator of your social rank. Now, contrast that with the peasant's experience. For the lower classes, privacy was almost non-existent. Bedrooms were usually shared by the entire family, with multiple generations often crammed into the same room. Sleep was a communal experience in these homes, with entire families, and sometimes animals, squeezed into one space. Even if the family had a separate sleeping area, it was often no more than a small alcove in a single room. These humble beds were usually made from straw or wool, spread out over a wooden frame, The sheets were rough, and the mattresses often had to be refilled with straw periodically to maintain any semblance of comfort. It was common for peasants to sleep in their clothes because there wasn't enough space to store extra clothing, let alone the luxury of a change of linens. Interestingly, the division in sleeping conditions wasn't just about physical comfort. It was also a reflection of medieval class structure. The wealthier you were, the more comfortable your sleep, while the poor were left to sleep in cramped, noisy spaces with minimal comfort. But even among the rich, there was a strong social component to sleeping arrangements. Nobles didn't just sleep in isolation because they preferred it. It was an indication of their status. Nobles had separate chambers for rest, and servants or lower-ranking members of the household were often expected to sleep near or around their masters. Historians still argue whether this division in sleeping arrangements was solely a matter of comfort, or whether it symbolized a deeper divide between social classes. Some suggest that the physical discomfort experienced by the poor made them more resilient to hardship, while others believe that the greater comfort enjoyed by the wealthy helped reinforce the power imbalance. Either way, sleep in medieval times wasn't just about rest. It was a stark reminder of the divide between the classes. Imagine the sharp contrast between the creaky straw mattresses of a peasant's home and the plush, yet still primitive, feather beds of the noble. One had to contend with a room full of people and animals, while the other might enjoy the luxury of a private chamber, though still without modern comfort. In either case, sleep wasn't exactly a peaceful, restful activity. It was something you simply had to make do with. Let's turn our attention now to something you might not expect to be tied to medieval sleep: food and drink. The way people ate before bed in medieval times had a surprisingly big impact on their sleep patterns and their sleep quality. You're probably used to having a light snack or a warm drink before bed, something to help you relax and wind down. But in the Middle Ages, what you ate or didn't eat could either help you sleep or give you nightmares. For most medieval people, the evening meal was the most substantial of the day. For the poor, dinner usually consisted of a thick, hearty porridge or a chunk of bread with whatever meat or vegetables were available. The wealthy, of course, could afford a more luxurious meal, with multiple courses, wine, meats, and savory pies. But what did this all have to do with sleep? Let's start with alcohol. Medieval people didn't just enjoy their wine or ale with dinner. They often drank right before bed, and it wasn't just for relaxation. Drinking alcohol, especially beer or wine, was a regular part of their daily routine, in part because it was safer than drinking water. Boiling water for brewing or fermenting removed many harmful bacteria, making it more palatable and safer to drink. But alcohol, particularly in the form of strong ale, was often consumed in large quantities before bed. Some historians suggest that the alcohol in their systems helped induce a kind of drowsy state that allowed them to sleep more easily, though the quality of that sleep was debatable, considering the hangover that followed the next day. Historians still argue about how much alcohol consumption affected the quality of medieval sleep. On one hand, it's clear that alcohol was used to numb the body and the mind, leading to a less restful sleep than we're accustomed to today. On the other hand, some researchers argue that alcohol helped medieval people cope with the stresses and physical exhaustion of their days. In a time with few medical remedies for pain or stress, a glass of wine or ale was an affordable form of sedation and comfort. But there was another aspect of food that also impacted sleep: the idea of heavy meals. Those hearty medieval dinners, full of fatty meats, Rich pies and breads were often eaten late in the evening. A heavy meal right before bed would leave your body working overtime to digest, leading to restless nights. If you've ever had a big dinner that sat heavily in your stomach before you tried to sleep, you know exactly what I mean. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of digestive aids like we do today, and their sleep was often disturbed by the weight of their food. Then there were the spices. Wealthy people, in particular, would indulge in heavily spiced dishes. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were considered not only flavorful, but also medicinal. Some of these spices were thought to aid digestion, while others were believed to have more magical properties, like warding off bad dreams or evil spirits. Historians are still unsure whether these spices actually had any impact on sleep quality, but they were often mixed into late-night meals, perhaps in an effort to stave off nightmares or promote sweet dreams. Some even believed that consuming these sleep-promoting spices before bed could bring about more pleasant dreams or prevent night terrors. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval people would also keep a small bottle of sleeping herbs by their bedside. This wasn't an herbal remedy as we know it today. It was often a mixture of various herbs, including things like lavender, chamomile, and even valerian root, which was known for its sedative properties. People would sometimes rub these herbs onto their pillows or sprinkle them under their sheets, hoping for a peaceful, uninterrupted night. It's funny to think that their version of sleep aids wasn't all that different from the pillows and sprays we might use today. So, the next time you're sipping a warm drink before bed, consider how the medieval folks did it. Sure, their meals may have been heavier and their alcohol a little stronger, but their bedtime snacks were just as much a part of their sleep ritual as ours are today, only with a lot more spices and probably a bit more hangover. Let's now look at the fascinating connection between hygiene, or the lack thereof, and medieval sleep. In our modern world, we often associate a clean bed and fresh linens with a good night's rest. But in medieval times, this wasn't exactly the case. Cleanliness wasn't exactly high on the priority list for most people, and when it came to sleep, it meant enduring a level of discomfort that would be almost unthinkable today. The idea of a spotless bed was foreign to most medieval people, and sleep wasn't something that happened in pristine conditions. For one thing, the medieval period had a very different approach to hygiene. Bathing was a rare and somewhat complicated practice. People didn't bathe regularly as we do now, and when they did, it was often more of a communal activity than a personal one. Public bathhouses were common in medieval cities, but even then, bathing wasn't necessarily seen as something that was done frequently. The upper classes might bathe once a month, while the poor might go months without a proper bath. Instead, they relied on more basic forms of cleanliness, washing their faces and hands, and perhaps wiping down their bodies with a damp cloth when necessary. This lack of regular bathing directly impacted the quality of sleep. Imagine lying down on a mattress that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, covered in layers of dust, sweat, and whatever else had settled in over time. Straw mattresses, common in many medieval homes, were ideal breeding grounds for insects, and the constant exposure to dirt, sweat, and oils from the body made them an uncomfortable place to sleep. The bed linens themselves weren't changed frequently, and when they were often just rough, unwashed sheets that did little to keep you comfortable. Medieval people weren't just sleeping on straw, they were sleeping in it, with all the germs, bugs, and filth that came with it. You can imagine how much tossing and turning would go on in an attempt to find a relatively clean spot on the bed. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more tolerant of this discomfort than we are today, or if they simply didn't understand the importance of cleanliness. Some believe that people were simply used to their unhygienic conditions and didn't see them as abnormal. Others suggest that medieval folk simply didn't have the same understanding of germs and bacteria that we do today. So they didn't think about hygiene in the same way. One thing is clear. While we might recoil at the thought of lying on unwashed straw with a layer of sweat and dust, it was just a part of life for medieval people. A quirky tidbit. Medieval people didn't just have to contend with the physical dirt in their beds. Superstition also played a role in their approach to cleanliness. Some believed that dirty bedding or lack of personal hygiene could attract bad spirits, illness, or misfortune. To ward off these effects, they might hang herbs like rosemary or lavender near the bed to ward off evil spirits, or sprinkle the bed with salt. Salt was thought to have purifying properties, and keeping a handful of it under the pillow was believed to help prevent nightmares and ensure peaceful sleep. So, while your modern bed may be fresh, soft, and clean, medieval beds were anything but. Sleeping in a bed that was rarely, if ever, washed meant you had to make peace with a little dirt and discomfort. And while that might sound unpleasant to us now, it was just the reality of the time. Whether they were aware of it or not, medieval people slept in environments that weren't exactly conducive to the best rest, but they adapted and made do with what they had. Now that we've explored the rather uncomfortable realities of medieval sleep, let's take a deep dive into the dream world of the medieval mind. While today we might toss and turn about our upcoming work presentations or ponder our day-to-day stresses, medieval people had a different relationship with dreams. Sleep wasn't just about rest. It was an arena for spiritual reflection, warnings, and sometimes downright bizarre dreams that could shape their waking lives. In the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously. People believed that dreams were a window to the divine, a way for the supernatural to communicate with the waking world. A dream could be an omen or a message from God, a saint, or even a demon. Because of this belief, medieval people often sought out dream interpreters who could decipher the meaning behind their nighttime visions. For example, if you dreamt about flying, it might be seen as a sign of spiritual ascension, while a dream about falling could be interpreted as a warning about personal failure or sin. And let's not even get started on those nightmares. They weren't just bad dreams. They were considered to be visits from evil spirits or demons. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed their dreams had supernatural significance, or if these beliefs were culturally ingrained to give them a sense of order in a world full of uncertainties. One thing is clear: dream interpretation was an essential part of medieval life, much more so than it is today. The dream world wasn't just the realm of personal subconscious. It was a place where divine and malevolent forces interacted with individuals, often dictating their behavior in the waking world. Interestingly, medieval people also used sleep as a time for spiritual connection. The act of sleeping itself was considered a time of vulnerability, and therefore, it was seen as a prime opportunity for divine intervention or a visit from the devil. Nighttime prayers, the use of holy objects near the bed, and the wearing of religious symbols were all common practices to protect the sleeper from malevolent forces during their slumber. People would even have their beds blessed by priests in the hopes of warding off nightmares and ensuring that their dreams would be of a more virtuous nature. A quirky detail. Some medieval people believed that certain sleep positions could influence the quality of dreams. For example, sleeping with your head facing east was thought to bring about good dreams, or spiritual guidance. While sleeping on your back could make you more susceptible to nightmares or demonic visitations, people would often sleep in the same position every night, convinced that it would lead to the best night's rest or the most favorable dreams. This may sound a little superstitious to us, but in a world where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms were so porous, this sort of belief made perfect sense. You can almost imagine medieval people waking from a restless sleep, sitting up, and immediately consulting their dream books or speaking to the village priest about the meaning behind their strange nighttime experiences. Dream interpretation wasn't just a pastime. It was an essential part of the medieval approach to understanding the world around them. If your dreams foretold disaster, you could take steps to avoid it. If your dreams were of a religious or heavenly nature, they could be taken as a sign of personal righteousness. In a sense, sleep in medieval times was a dual experience. While your body rested, your soul was believed to be on a journey of its own, encountering divine or demonic forces. As you drifted off to sleep, your night wasn't just filled with the quiet of darkness. It was alive with the possibility of spiritual guidance, otherworldly visitations, and a deeper understanding of your place in the cosmos. As we close in on the end of this deep dive into medieval sleep, it's fascinating to reflect on how some of these ancient customs and habits still manage to influence us today. You might not be burning candles made from animal fat or sleeping on a straw mattress, but certain medieval sleep patterns, social customs, and even superstitions have quietly made their way into our modern routines. In fact, when you really think about it, some of the ways we sleep today aren't all that different from the medieval world, despite the technological advances and comforts that separate us. Take, for instance, the idea of segmented sleep we discussed earlier. While most of us don't wake up in the middle of the night for productive purposes, the general structure of how we sleep is not too far off from medieval practices. People today often wake up in the middle of the night, perhaps without even realizing it, and many use that wakeful time to check their phones, catch up on late-night thoughts, or, in some cases, visit the bathroom. While we no longer live in a world without electricity, many of us still have natural sleep cycles that involve waking up at least once during the night, just as people did centuries ago. There's also the legacy of communal living that lingers in the way we view shared spaces. While modern homes are built with private bedrooms, there are still places in the world where multiple generations live together in the same home, sharing not just their lives, but their sleeping quarters. Communal sleeping may have been a necessity for medieval peasants, but it also fostered a sense of community and closeness that some modern families still value today. Though the exact social and physical dynamics have changed, the idea of shared spaces and collective rest is something that has persisted through time. And then, of course, there's the idea of dreams and spiritual connections with sleep. While we might not consult a priest about our dreams or consider them to be divine omens, the deep human need for meaning and reflection during sleep still exists. Many people today use sleep as a time for reflection, whether it's through meditation, prayer, or simply processing the events of the day. Dreams, for some, are still a source of inspiration, guidance, or even anxiety. Just as medieval people relied on dream books and priests for interpretation, modern-day dream enthusiasts still look to symbols and meanings to find deeper significance in their subconscious experiences. Here's a quirky modern twist. If medieval people were alive today, they'd probably be shocked at how much we obsess over sleep. From high-tech mattresses that monitor your REM cycles to the endless gadgets promising a better night's rest. Modern society is obsessed with optimizing sleep. But in a sense, this is just a more technologically advanced version of medieval superstitions and rituals. Only now, we turn to apps and experts instead of holy books and dream interpreters. We still long for the same restful, rejuvenating sleep medieval people sought, albeit through different methods. But let's not forget the most striking difference between medieval and modern sleep: comfort. Imagine yourself lying on a straw mattress, with the sound of livestock, the cold air seeping in, and the constant weight of discomfort on your body. Now, imagine the plush softness of your modern mattress, your cozy blankets, and the soothing coolness of your room. In many ways, we are incredibly fortunate in how much we can optimize our sleep for comfort. The challenges medieval people faced during their nights of rest remind us how far we've come and how lucky we are to enjoy such simple comforts. As you lie back and settle in for your own night of sleep tonight, think about those medieval souls, huddled under heavy blankets, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the rustle of the straw mattress beneath them. While their sleep was far from ideal, it was an essential part of their daily rhythms. And in its own way, it was a testament to human resilience and the enduring need to rest and recover, no matter the circumstances. As we move forward in exploring the world of medieval sleep, it's important to talk about the one thing that everyone in the medieval world shared. No matter their class or occupation, the night. But nights in medieval times were dramatically different from what we experience today, thanks to the role of light, or more accurately, the lack of it. When the sun went down, the world became a very different place, with no streetlights, no electricity, and no way to easily extend the day. Medieval people had to rely on what little light they could produce to guide them through the hours of darkness, and that light, or lack thereof, had a huge impact on their sleep. Imagine the difference between your night and theirs. You've probably got your room lit with soft lighting, maybe even some candles or lamps, or perhaps you prefer complete darkness to help you sleep. But for the medieval person, the night was defined by flickering flames, whether from a hearth fire, a candle, or a rushlight. The light these sources provided was weak at best, and the dark shadows cast on the walls must have created a sense of eerie, oppressive quiet in the house. For many, the only light during their waking hours would be the soft flicker of a candle or the steady glow from the hearth, both of which did little to illuminate the room. This absence of light played a crucial role in sleep. Without a reliable way to brighten the night, people went to sleep early, often right after the evening meal. There was no late-night scrolling or socializing under bright lights. Instead, their daily routines and sleep patterns were entirely dependent on the rhythm of the sun. When the sun set, so did the day. In a way, this natural cycle of light and dark dictated their ability to rest and gave way to the segmented sleep patterns we discussed earlier. Historians still debate whether this absence of artificial light made people sleep better. Some argue that without the distractions of modern life, TV, phones, or bright lights, they were more attuned to their natural sleep cycles, which might have been more restorative. Others point out that the dim lighting and early bedtimes could have led to poorer sleep quality due to the constant exposure to smoke and the lack of privacy. Either way, the lack of light shaped how people slept, making nightfall a signal not just for rest, but for a complete shift in lifestyle and routine. In a way, the medieval person's relationship to sleep was more natural than our modern one. They lived by the rhythm of the sun, and their rest came in cycles dictated by the limitations of light. The world of sleep back then was tied to the seasons, to the cycle of day and night, and to the light, or lack of it, that guided their every moment of rest. Let's now explore the powerful influence the church had on sleep during the medieval period. Religion was woven into the fabric of every part of life during this time, and sleep was no exception. The church's teachings about the sanctity of sleep shaped not only how people viewed rest, but also how they prepared for it, both physically and spiritually. If you lived in medieval Europe, the church had an undeniable influence on your nightly routine. For the majority of medieval people, sleep wasn't just about resting the body. It was about maintaining spiritual purity. The church believed that sleep was a sacred act, one that allowed you to rest your body and soul. In fact, some religious orders viewed sleep as an opportunity for holy rest, a time for reflection, prayer, and even visions. The idea of holy sleep wasn't just about physical renewal. It was a way to connect with the divine, to purge the body and soul of sin through peaceful slumber. Many people turned to prayer or other religious rituals before bed to ensure they had a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Saying prayers before sleep was considered a form of protection from evil spirits and from the anxiety of the day's struggles. The Compline Prayer, for example, was the final prayer of the day before going to bed, asking for protection throughout the night and for God's grace to shield them from danger or nightmares. Monks, nuns, and devout Christians often said a specific prayer for sleep, invoking God's blessing to provide them with peaceful rest. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval people truly believed that sleep had a spiritual dimension, or whether they simply used religion as a comfort and a ritual to help them cope with the uncertainty and discomfort of their lives. For many, sleep was a form of physical rest, but also a time to reflect on their spiritual well-being. That belief in holy sleep extended beyond just the individual to the concept of a blessed bed. In fact, it was common for people to have their beds blessed by priests before they went to sleep, ensuring they had divine protection. There was also the practice of placing religious symbols or relics in the bedroom for protection. Crucifixes, holy water, and blessed rosaries were often placed near the bed or hung on the walls to ward off evil spirits and ensure a peaceful night's sleep. This idea of divine protection went hand in hand with the belief that sleep was a time to be spiritually cleansed, making it an integral part of daily religious life. A quirky detail: some medieval people, particularly the wealthy, would go so far as to have their bedding and sleeping garments blessed, ensuring that they were protected from nightmares and unwanted dreams. For some, the act of sleeping was almost like a mini pilgrimage, as they would spiritually prepare themselves for sleep just as they would prepare for a religious ritual. So, while we may think of sleep as simply a time for physical rest, the medieval person saw it as an opportunity to connect with the divine and ensure spiritual peace. The church's influence was clear. Sleep wasn't just about recuperation. It was about maintaining a strong spiritual foundation, even as you rested your body for the next day's work. Let's now take a look at how the changing seasons affected medieval sleep patterns. While today we may adjust our sleep habits slightly based on the time of year, maybe a bit more sleep during the cold winter months or adjusting to daylight savings time, the rhythm of sleep for medieval people was much more closely tied to the natural world. The seasons didn't just affect what people ate or wore. They had a significant impact on when and how long people slept. During the longer summer days, medieval people slept less. The sun rose early, and the daylight hours were full of work and activity. The longer daylight meant that people stayed awake for much longer hours. often working in the fields or around the house until the very last minute of daylight. The warmth and light from the sun were precious resources, and the idea of wasting time during daylight hours was almost unthinkable. People woke at dawn, worked hard through the day, and when the sun began to set, they'd start to wind down. In contrast, during the winter months, when the days were shorter and the nights longer, people slept more. The darkness and cold of winter meant fewer hours of work, and the long nights left little else to do but sleep. It wasn't unusual for medieval people to sleep up to 10 or even 12 hours during the winter, making the most of the extended night hours. As we've discussed, segmented sleep was common, so people would often take an evening nap after the first sleep cycle, especially in the colder months. This winter sleep cycle helped conserve energy and keep them warm during the bitter cold, making use of those long, dark hours when it was difficult to do much else. Historians still argue whether the seasonal variations in sleep led to physical or psychological effects over time. Some suggest that the additional rest in winter helped prepare the body for the physical demands of the spring and summer, when work would intensify. Others argue that the extended sleep in winter could also have had negative effects on the body, leading to sluggishness or feelings of lethargy during the longer nights. Still, the rhythm of sleep dictated by the seasons was a natural part of life in the medieval world, far more ingrained in their routines than it is for most of us today. Another interesting note about the seasonal sleep cycle is how the cold temperatures affected the sleeping arrangements themselves. In the colder months, people would often sleep closer to the hearth to absorb the heat. This wasn't just about comfort, it was survival. In larger homes and castles, separate rooms would often be used for sleeping. But these rooms were still subject to the outside temperatures, so warmth became a priority. Larger houses and castles were drafty, and even with multiple fires burning, the cold seeped in. In contrast, those living in smaller homes or cottages used the heat from the hearth to maintain warmth throughout the night. But the downside was that the heat from the fire made the sleeping areas uncomfortable in its own way, far from the ideal cozy warmth we might associate with a perfect winter night's sleep. In essence, sleep in the medieval period wasn't just influenced by the clock, but by the very rhythms of nature. It was dictated by the rise and fall of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the environment in which people lived. Their bodies adapted to the seasons, with sleep becoming longer in the winter and shorter in the summer. And every season brought its own challenges, comforts, and adjustments to the sleep routine. Now, let's dive into the fascinating ways medieval people kept warm while sleeping. In our modern world, staying warm at night is relatively easy. We simply turn on the heater or wrap ourselves in a duvet, and we're good to go. But for the people of the Middle Ages, staying warm at night wasn't such a simple task. The medieval period was a time when heating systems were rudimentary at best, and staying warm while you slept was a battle against the elements. The first line of defense against the cold was, of course, the fire. We've already discussed how the hearth was central to medieval homes. But it wasn't just for cooking or providing light. It was their primary source of heat. In wealthier homes, the fire might be in a separate room that also doubled as the family's main living space. But in smaller cottages, the hearth was often right there in the bedroom, providing the only source of warmth. The closer you were to the fire, the warmer you'd be. But it wasn't without its challenges. The heat from the fire would dissipate quickly as it spread through the room, and the firewood itself could be difficult to come by, making it a precious resource. If you didn't have a steady supply of firewood, you'd need to make do with whatever you could find, including old furniture or scrap wood, which wouldn't always keep the fire burning through the night. For those without access to a fire, staying warm was a constant struggle. They relied on whatever natural elements they had at hand. People would use animal furs, wool blankets, and thick linen sheets to insulate themselves from the cold. In fact, the use of fur was so common that it became synonymous with warmth. Peasants and nobles alike used whatever animal skins they could get, whether from sheep, cows, or even wild animals like deer or rabbits, to cover their beds. These furs would help trap body heat and act as a barrier against the cold stone walls of the home. Historians still argue about the exact comfort level of sleeping in furs. On the one hand, they were incredibly effective at keeping heat in, but they were also heavy, bulky, and often somewhat stiff. Imagine trying to move around in your sleep while wrapped in thick fur and heavy wool. While it might have kept you warm, it wasn't the most comfortable setup, especially considering how often these furs would also attract pests. They could be itchy and uncomfortable, making sleep a little less restful than we'd like to think. Additionally, in the middle of winter, it wasn't uncommon for people to sleep fully clothed, layering on extra tunics or woolen garments before heading to bed. For many medieval people, sleep was a matter of survival, and wearing layers upon layers of clothing while in bed was a practical necessity. This didn't leave much room for comfort, but it did ensure that they could survive the freezing temperatures that could often dip below freezing, even in the warmer months. The colder the season, the more layers you'd need to pile on, making for a less than comfortable sleeping situation. To add to the discomfort, even wealthy households didn't have heated floors or central heating like we have today. Even castles with grand fireplaces and thick tapestries to block the drafts still left their occupants vulnerable to the cold. And let's not forget about the seasonal shift. During the winter, medieval people often woke up early, as the long hours of darkness meant that they were limited to how much sleep they could get before the morning light began to flood the room. The chill would motivate them to rise earlier than desired, starting another long day in the cold. A quirky detail. Some medieval people even slept with hot stones wrapped in cloth or tucked under the blankets to warm their beds. The stone would absorb heat during the day from the fire, and then, when the bed was made, it would be placed at the foot of the bed to offer some warmth. While it may not have been the perfect heating system, it was a clever way to bring a little warmth into the frigid nighttime hours. It's hard to imagine sleeping in such challenging conditions, but for medieval people, this was part of their reality. The battle against the cold was a constant. Whether it was relying on the heat of the hearth, the warmth of layers, or the heavy weight of furs, these efforts were essential for survival. But they also made for a far less restful night's sleep than we're accustomed to. Now, let's explore the significant impact that illness and disease had on medieval sleep, especially during times of widespread outbreaks like the Black Death. The medieval period was no stranger to plagues, infections, and widespread illness, and these conditions profoundly affected not only the quality of sleep, but also the very way people viewed rest. In fact, sleep during a time of illness was a whole different experience, sometimes filled with dread and often deeply tied to the fate of the individual. The Black Death, for example, swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing millions of people and causing widespread fear. For those who fell ill, sleep was often a desperate escape, a time of suffering and anxiety. Many medieval people believed that diseases like the plague were sent as divine punishment for sin, And so sleep during these times wasn't just about resting. It was about trying to escape the terror of what might come next. Infected people often experienced feverish dreams, delirium, and night sweats. Their sleep cycles were interrupted by the agony of their illness, making restful sleep nearly impossible. Those who were lucky enough to escape the worst of the outbreaks still experienced the ripple effects of the fear and anxiety that swept across the population. Even healthy people had disturbed sleep due to the constant worry about getting sick. This fear became a cultural norm, with many people resorting to superstitions and charms to protect themselves from the plague. Medieval people believed that certain objects or rituals could ward off illness, including placing garlic under the pillow, wearing amulets, or even sleeping with certain herbs near their beds. In terms of hygiene, the lack of regular cleaning made medieval homes and sleeping spaces breeding grounds for bacteria and pests, which further contributed to the spread of diseases. Fleas, lice, and rats were common companions in the home and in the bed. And these pests were not only uncomfortable, but also played a role in the transmission of diseases like the plague. Imagine trying to sleep through the incessant itching of fleas or the scurrying of rats. While this might sound like a nightmare, it was an unfortunate part of life for medieval people. Even the wealthier individuals, who may have had more insulated homes and finer bedding, weren't immune to the discomfort caused by pests. The lack of medical knowledge during this period meant that sleep during times of illness could also be filled with confusion and misinformation. Without antibiotics or modern treatments, medieval people turned to whatever remedies they had available. Herbal concoctions, leeches, and even bloodletting were common practices, but often they did little to ease the suffering. Sleep during these times became a way to escape pain or, for some, a final act before succumbing to illness. When someone in the family fell ill, sleep wasn't the restful sanctuary it is today. It was often filled with fear and dread for both the sick and their caretakers. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced better sleep when they weren't ill, given their rough living conditions, or if the constant stress and anxiety of living in a disease-ridden world robbed them of the ability to rest properly. Some even suggest that the collective trauma caused by epidemics like the Black Death affected the sleep patterns of entire generations, making sleep more restless and anxiety-ridden. A quirky fact: despite the grim circumstances, some medieval people believed that certain dreams, even those during illness, were prophetic or healing. If someone had a dream about a saint or holy figure, they often took it as a sign that the person would recover from illness. This belief in dream healing shows just how intertwined the medieval mind was with spiritual interpretations of physical suffering. In the end, sleep during times of illness in the medieval period was marked by a sense of vulnerability, anxiety, and fear. For many, it was a time of escape. But for others, it was a grim precursor to death. It's a stark reminder of just how much the lack of medical understanding and the prevalence of disease shaped the way people rested or couldn't rest during this dark chapter in history. As we reach the final stretch of our journey through the medieval world of sleep, let's step back for a moment and reflect on how the practice of sleep has evolved from those difficult, uncomfortable days. While we may have modern mattresses, climate control, and nearly endless ways to ensure we sleep well, the trajectory of sleep throughout history, from the medieval period to today, is fascinating. The way we sleep now is the result of centuries of trial, error, and sometimes rather creative solutions to the challenges of rest. Medieval people's sleep habits were primarily shaped by the environment around them: harsh winters, the lack of proper lighting, and the constant need to make do with what was available. For the majority, sleep wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about survival. About finding rest amidst the struggle to live in a world that offered few creature comforts. What they had in terms of bedding was rudimentary. Their nighttime rituals were often tied to faith and superstition, and their sleep environments, shared with family and sometimes animals, were a far cry from the solitude and comfort most of us enjoy today. But it wasn't all bad. In fact, medieval sleep had its own set of rhythms and customs that, in some ways, were beneficial to the people living through them. The practice of segmented sleep, for example, might have offered more natural sleep patterns, early to bed, with a break in the middle of the night for prayer, work, or reflection. Perhaps the hurried, restless sleep we get today, with late nights in front of screens and early mornings for work, has some lessons to learn from the simplicity of those early sleep cycles. The way medieval people worked with their environment, adapting to the rhythms of light, the seasons, and the demands of survival, offers a quiet kind of wisdom about how we could approach our own rest. Let's not forget the great irony. While we live in an era of technological advancements that make sleep far more comfortable, we are also facing a modern sleep crisis. With access to air-conditioned rooms, adjustable beds, and all manner of sleep aids, we're still struggling with poor sleep quality. Issues like insomnia, restless nights, and sleep deprivation are widespread, and we often find ourselves searching for ways to improve our sleep, whether it's through apps, therapies, or sleep clinics. In a sense, the quest for perfect rest has not changed much since medieval times, despite the drastic differences in the sleep environment. Some historians argue that the medieval approach to sleep, simple, unadorned, and shaped by the cycle of nature, may have been closer to an ideal sleep rhythm than we realize. Their segmented sleep, waking naturally in the middle of the night, might have allowed for more restorative, deeper rest than our single sleep cycle, which is often disrupted by artificial light and stress. Even their communal living arrangements, though uncomfortable, fostered a sense of security that modern living sometimes lacks. The emotional comfort of sharing space with others might have helped provide a sense of peace, something we might miss in our isolated, solo sleep world. As we look back at how sleep has evolved from medieval days to now, it's clear that the challenges of sleep haven't changed much, just the tools and techniques we use to try to overcome them. The medieval world didn't have the luxury of modern sleep aids, but they did have ingenuity and resilience. Whether it was the constant adjustment to seasonal changes, the use of fire for warmth, or the spiritual connection to sleep, medieval people crafted their rest in ways that suited their needs. And so, as you rest your head on your soft, pillow-filled bed tonight, remember the medieval world's approach to sleep, simple, humble, but undeniably essential. It was a far cry from today's sleep paradise, but it was still a vital part of the human experience. A world of noise, hardship, superstition, and resilience that offered a unique perspective on what it truly means to rest. As we bring our journey through medieval sleep habits to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on the lasting legacy of these practices. It's easy to assume that the medieval period was a time of chaos and discomfort. But when you really dig into the history of sleep, you begin to see that many of the struggles and routines they endured have shaped how we sleep today. While we may never go back to the days of straw mattresses, communal sleeping, or burning animal fat candles, the underlying need for rest and the cultural rituals surrounding sleep continue to persist, sometimes in surprising ways. First, let's acknowledge the resilience and adaptability of medieval people. Despite the hardships of their time, whether it was the discomfort of their beds, the lack of privacy, or the constant battle against the cold, they found ways to make sleep work for them. The communal nature of their sleep routines might sound foreign to us, but it fostered a sense of togetherness and security. And for them, it was simply the way things were. Today, we often find ourselves longing for a sense of community or connection, even in our solitary, modern sleep experiences. While we might not share a bed with siblings and farm animals, there's still something comforting about the idea of shared rest and collective safety. Historians still argue whether the medieval approach to sleep, with all its discomforts, was a product of necessity or if it was shaped by social and religious customs. For many, sleep was not just a break from daily labor. It was an opportunity for spiritual reflection and guidance. The use of prayers, charms, and rituals to protect against nightmares or evil spirits is a far cry from today's scientific approach to sleep hygiene. Yet, in many ways, the need to ward off bad dreams or ensure restful sleep through spiritual means persists in modern society, albeit in more secular ways. From the soothing sounds of sleep apps to the calming effects of meditation, we still turn to rituals to help us prepare for sleep and soothe our restless minds. In the modern world, we've managed to make sleep more comfortable, more private, and more controlled than ever before. Temperature-regulated mattresses, blackout curtains, and white noise machines have revolutionized how we rest. Yet, even with all these advancements, we still face the same basic need that medieval people did: a space to rest, recover, and disconnect from the pressures of the day. The way we approach sleep may have changed, but the core need for rest, reflection, and renewal remains the same. And then there's the dream world. Medieval people believed that dreams were filled with divine meaning, offering guidance, warnings, and insights into their lives. While today we may not interpret dreams as directly or spiritually as they did, there's still a deep fascination with what our subconscious reveals during sleep, whether we consult dream dictionaries or simply reflect on our dreams. The connection between sleep and our deeper selves hasn't changed. As we wind down, remember that the story of medieval sleep is more than just a tale of discomfort and inconvenience. It's about human perseverance, the search for rest, and the rituals that have been passed down through generations. Medieval people faced difficult conditions, yet their approach to sleep, with its communal nature, spiritual significance, and resilience in the face of hardship, echoes through history in ways we can still recognize today. So, as you lie in your comfortable bed, think of those medieval souls who slept in much different circumstances. Let their story be a reminder of how far we've come, and how universal the need for a peaceful, restorative night's sleep truly is. Now, let your mind drift away, knowing that just like those long-ago sleepers, you too are on a journey of rest and renewal.